I am Arthur, 28 years old. For 20 long, agonizing years, my family treated me like an absolute ghost in my own home, completely ignoring my existence in favor of my golden child older brother, Julian. While I was sitting quietly at our annual Thanksgiving dinner, minding my own business and eating my dry turkey, my mother looked down the expansive mahogany table at me and said, "Are you still playing around with those little computer apps, Arthur? You really need to find a job with a real salary so you do not end up homeless or begging us for your inheritance." They laughed at me in front of 12 extended family members. My brother smirked like he had just won the lottery, and my father just shook his head in profound disappointment. But there is one thing they did not know. I had a massive secret hidden in my tailored suit jacket pocket. I had just sold my tech company for $310 million. And now, they are facing absolute financial ruin, crying, and begging me for a piece of the pie to save their precious real estate investments. Before I tell you exactly what happened and how I completely turned the tables on them, hit that like button if you believe in justice and earning your own way in this world. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments section below. Now, let us go back to where this entire nightmare began. The dining room smelled of roasted turkey, heavy sage stuffing, and incredibly expensive Cabernet Sauvignon that my father had decanted 2 hours prior. It was the exact same Thanksgiving setup we had every single year at my parents' massive, sprawling estate in the most exclusive zip code of Connecticut. The crystal glasses gleamed under the antique chandelier, casting sharp little rainbows across the fine linen tablecloth. The conversation was, as it always had been for my entire life, entirely dominated by my 35-year-old brother, Julian, and his insufferable fiancé, Preston. I was sitting near the absolute end of the table, wedged awkwardly between my Aunt Beatrice and a distant cousin who had not spoken a single word to me all evening. I was completely used to this dynamic. I was the furniture. I was the guy you invited because blood obligation and social appearances demanded it, not because anyone actually wanted to hear my voice or know anything about my life. Julian was busy holding court at the center of the room, loudly bragging about a minor promotion at his mid-level marketing firm. He wore a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first car, leaning back in his chair with the unearned confidence of a man who had never faced a real consequence in his life. My parents were leaning in toward him, their eyes shining with absolute, unfiltered adoration. You would think the man had just cured a major global disease or negotiated world peace. My father, Richard, kept nodding and raising his wine glass in silent tribute to Julian's incredibly mediocre achievements. Preston, an arrogant hedge fund manager who insisted on wearing a full tailored suit to a family holiday dinner, was swirling his dark red wine and talking about the $2 million real estate property they were currently looking to purchase in Westchester. He made a very specific point to mention the neighborhood's strict HOA meetings, the exclusivity of the local country club, and the sheer prestige of the zip code. Everyone at the table made soft sounds of pure awe and deep admiration. Aunt Beatrice actually clapped her hands together like a delighted seal. Then, inevitably, the spotlight swung over to me. It was never a warm spotlight. It was a harsh, blinding interrogation lamp designed to expose my supposed failures. Aunt Beatrice leaned over, her heavy, suffocating floral perfume completely masking the smell of the savory food, and asked if I was still living in that tiny little apartment in Boston and working on my little computer games. That was the exact cue my mother, Eleanor, needed. She placed her silver fork down on her gold-rimmed china plate, looked at me with a mixture of pity and deep embarrassment, and delivered her humiliating line about me needing a real salary and worrying about my future inheritance. The laughter that followed her comment was not loud, but it was incredibly sharp and deeply malicious. It was the condescending, synchronized chuckle of people who believed they were fundamentally better than you in every conceivable way. I looked at Julian. He was smiling, a smug, deeply satisfied expression plastered across his perfectly groomed, moisturized face. I looked at my father. He did not defend me. He did not tell them to lay off or show a shred of basic human decency. He just stared at me with this heavy, silent judgment, as if my very existence was a poor reflection on his pristine legacy. I reached slowly into the inner pocket of my dark suit jacket. My fingers brushed against the crisp, perfectly folded bank statements and the finalized legal acquisition paperwork. I felt my heart steady in my chest. I did not feel angry. I did not feel small or insignificant. I felt a cold, absolute, terrifying calm wash over my entire body. I pulled the thick stack of papers out, set them gently on the fine linen tablecloth right next to my water goblet, and casually cleared my throat. What happened next shattered their perfect, arrogant, carefully constructed reality into a million jagged little pieces. But to understand the absolute gravity of that specific moment, and exactly why I let them humiliate themselves so thoroughly before I dropped the hammer, you have to understand the 20 years of sheer, suffocating invisibility I endured to get to that chair. I thought the worst part of growing up was the lack of money or resources, but I was so incredibly wrong. The absolute worst part was watching someone else get everything handed to them on a silver platter while you starved for a single, fleeting ounce of basic parental affection. I learned exactly how to become completely invisible when I was exactly 9 years old. It was a crisp, vividly bright autumn afternoon in Connecticut, and it was Julian's sweet 16th birthday. My parents had hyped this specific day up for months. They had secretly drained a significant portion of their liquid savings and practically neglected their own business just to ensure this day was entirely flawless for their golden boy. I was sitting alone in my small, dimly lit bedroom, looking out the second-story window, when a pristine silver Porsche rolled slowly up our long, winding driveway. It had a massive, ridiculous red bow slapped right on the hood, gleaming under the afternoon sun. My parents stepped out of the front door, beaming with a level of radiant pride I had never, ever seen directed at me. Julian ran out of the house, screaming at the top of his lungs, jumping up and down on the manicured lawn. He hugged my dad tightly, kissed my mom's cheek, and ran his hands all over the expensive leather interior of the sports car. The neighbors actually came out of their houses to clap and cheer. It was a sickening scene straight out of a cheesy, overly dramatic suburban television show. I stood silently by the glass pane, wearing a pair of clearance rack jeans that were slightly too short for my legs and a hand-me-down sweater that smelled faintly of mothballs. Nobody looked up at my window. Nobody called my name to come downstairs and join the massive family celebration. I was only 9 years old, but I understood the brutal mathematics of our family dynamic perfectly in that exact moment. Julian was the premium investment. I was the unfortunate tax penalty they had to write off every year. Julian was born when my parents were young, wildly ambitious, and deeply determined to mold the perfect heir to their growing, lucrative insurance brokerage. By the time I came along 7 long years later, the novelty of parenting had completely worn off. The meticulously crafted baby albums simply stopped existing. The spontaneous, fun family vacations turned into mandatory Julian's elite hockey camp trips, where I was dragged along just to sit in freezing cold bleachers for hours with a cheap coloring book. The divide became violently, undeniably clear when it came to our education. Julian was heavily enrolled at Westfield Academy, an elite, highly exclusive private institution that cost more per semester than most hardworking people make in an entire year. He wore a tailored navy blazer with a gold-embroidered crest. He had private lacrosse practice, mandatory Latin classes, and college prep counselors who catered to his every whim. I was sent to Franklin Public, a decaying, depressing brick building located 3 blocks from our house in the less desirable part of town. The roof leaked dirty brown water into the cafeteria whenever it rained. The outdated textbooks were missing entire chapters, and the sharp smell of industrial bleach permanently coated the narrow hallways. I remember coming home in middle school one afternoon, dropping my battered, duct-taped backpack on the pristine kitchen island, and finally finding the courage to ask the question that had been burning a hole in my chest for years. Mom, why does Julian get to go to Westfield Academy while I have to go to Franklin? My mother stopped meticulously chopping organic vegetables. She wiped her hands slowly on a designer kitchen towel, looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and deep annoyance, and delivered a line that I would hear echoing in my worst nightmares for years to come. Arthur, Julian requires a highly stimulating, competitive environment. He is incredibly talented and desperately needs that elite network for his future college fund strategy. You are doing perfectly fine where you are. Just keep your head down and focus on your basic studies. Perfectly fine. That phrase became my absolute prison sentence. Julian was destined for legendary greatness, and I was just supposed to exist quietly in the dusty background without costing them too much money or causing any social embarrassment. When Julian turned 18, they bought him a first-class ticket to Europe for the entire summer so he could find himself. When I turned 18, my mother handed me a crisp $20 bill and told me to order a cheap pepperoni pizza because they were too busy attending a high-society networking event to cook dinner. I did not cry. Crying was a massive waste of precious energy. Instead, I walked out of the house and went straight to the local public library. While Julian was learning how to sail yachts and network with wealthy trust fund kids in the Mediterranean, I was sitting at a slow, virus-infected public computer terminal reading heavy, complex digital books on advanced coding, software architecture, and deep data structures. I realized very early on that nobody in that house was ever going to hand me a life or a career. I had to build one from the absolute ground up, using nothing but my own sheer willpower. The true, devastating breaking point, the exact moment the final nail was violently driven into the coffin of my childhood innocence, was high school graduation. Julian had been accepted into Yale University. His academic grades were incredibly decent, but nowhere near exceptional. However, my father had pulled every single corporate string, called in every high-level favor, and made massive, undisclosed financial donations to secure that coveted spot. The day the thick acceptance letter arrived in the mail, they threw a massively catered gala in our expansive backyard. There were 50 wealthy guests, towering champagne fountains, a live jazz quartet, and a professional photographer capturing every fake smile. 3 years later, I graduated at the absolute top of my class at Franklin Public as the valedictorian. I was officially offered a full, comprehensive academic scholarship to a highly respected state university. I was incredibly proud of myself. I had worked grueling 80-hour weeks balancing terrible, grease-covered diner jobs and advanced placement classes just to maintain my flawless GPA. I brought the official scholarship letter home, foolishly hoping for even a tiny fraction of the immense joy Julian had received. My dad glanced quickly at the letter, nodded once with a totally blank expression, and handed it right back to me. State school. Good. At least we do not have to pay for it out of our own pockets. Keep your grades up so you don't lose the free ride. That night, to supposedly celebrate my full ride and years of academic dedication, they took me to a loud, sticky-floored Applebee's. We sat in a cramped booth that smelled like stale beer and cheap frying oil. Julian spent the entire dinner loudly complaining about his wealthy fraternity brothers at Yale and the subpar quality of the campus dining hall. My parents hung onto his every single word, offering deep sympathy for his incredibly privileged struggles. I ate my lukewarm burger in total, deafening silence. I realized right then and there that my personal successes would never, ever be measured by my own actual merit. They would only be measured by how much they inconvenienced or overshadowed Julian's carefully curated spotlight. I packed my cheap duffel bags for college 2 days later. I did not look back as I drove my beaten-up used car down the driveway. I truly thought physical distance would finally give me the peace and clarity I craved. I was so incredibly wrong. The real, destructive storm was just gathering on the horizon, and it was going to test every single ounce of my sanity. College was supposed to be my grand escape, my fresh start, but it quickly devolved into an absolute soul-crushing grind. I lived in a cramped, intensely humid dorm room that constantly smelled like stale chicken ramen and dangerously overheated electronics. While other college students were out at loud frat parties, football games, or sleeping off hangovers, I was permanently glued to my glowing laptop screen. I was double majoring in computer science and business administration, taking a massive course load, and in my spare time I was writing custom code for small, local logistics businesses just to pay for my weekly groceries. During the winter of my sophomore year, I noticed a massive, glaring gap in the market for automated supply chain management software specifically tailored to mid-level logistics and shipping companies. The existing corporate programs on the market were incredibly clunky, ridiculously expensive, and functionally outdated. I started building a streamlined, highly efficient solution completely from scratch in the dead of night. I called the software architecture NovaSync. I basically stopped sleeping. I survived entirely on cheap, acidic black coffee and sheer, unadulterated willpower. I poured every single ounce of my deep familial frustration, every painful memory of being ignored and sidelined, into thousands upon thousands of lines of flawless code. By the beginning of my junior year, I had a fully functional, highly impressive working prototype. I aggressively pitched it and landed my first small client, a local trucking company struggling with inventory tracking. They paid me $6,000 for the installation and licensing. The absolute high I felt from earning my own significant money, strictly through my own intellect and labor, was intensely intoxicating. But massive success, even in its early stages, always attracts dangerous vultures. I had a dorm roommate named Simon. Simon was a highly charismatic, incredibly lazy guy who skated through all his classes on his superficial charm and his wealthy parents' black credit cards. He saw the impressive checks coming in the mail. He saw my grueling late nights and the complex dashboards on my monitors. I foolishly trusted him just enough to leave my primary laptop open and unlocked when I went down the hall to the communal showers. That was a nearly fatal business-ending mistake. One evening, I logged securely into my main server and immediately noticed a massive, unauthorized data transfer protocol running in the background. Someone had systematically copied huge, foundational chunks of the proprietary NovaSync source code. Cold, paralyzing panic gripped my chest. I quickly ran a trace and tracked the specific IP address right back to Simon's expensive desktop computer sitting across the room. He was actively planning to pitch my software to a massive rival tech incubator under his own name the very next morning. I felt physically sick to my stomach. It was the exact same heavy feeling of profound betrayal I felt in my own house growing up, but this time it was my actual livelihood and my entire future on the line. I did not confront him physically. I did not scream or throw punches. I used my brain. I reached out frantically to a guy I had met on an advanced, highly exclusive cybersecurity coding forum, a brilliant, notoriously sharp student named Marcus. Marcus and I had been collaborating remotely on small side projects for months. I explained the dire situation over a heavily encrypted chat. Marcus did not hesitate for a single second. Within 3 tense hours, he helped me build a devastating digital backdoor directly into Simon's copied files. We completely corrupted the stolen code, injected a highly aggressive self-deleting script, and permanently locked Simon out of the primary development servers. When Simon confidently went to do his big, stolen presentation the next day in front of the wealthy investors, his program immediately crashed, flashed a giant error screen, and systematically deleted his entire hard drive, wiping out all his personal files in the process. He came storming back to the dorm room screaming, red in the face, violently threatening me with a massive lawsuit and claiming his father's expensive lawyer would destroy my life. I sat calmly on my unmade bed, looked him dead in his furious eyes, and handed him a thickly printed, highly detailed log of his illegal IP transfers and corporate espionage attempts. Go ahead and call a lawyer, Simon. I highly encourage it. I have the undeniable digital footprint of your attempted corporate theft. If you push this, you will be permanently expelled from this university, and you will go straight to jail for intellectual property theft. He went completely pale, packed all his bags in absolute silence, and moved out of the dorm that exact same night. Marcus officially joined me as my lead developer and business partner the very next morning. We became an incredibly fierce, unstoppable team, and NovaSync began to scale rapidly across the region. By the time I was 23 years old, I was running a highly legitimate, incredibly profitable tech company right out of a cheap off-campus apartment. I had just signed a massive, game-changing regional contract worth exactly $300,000. It was completely life-changing money. I could finally hire a real support staff. I could finally breathe without checking my bank account every 5 minutes. Easter weekend was fast approaching, and my mother had relentlessly guilt-tripped me over the phone into coming home for the traditional Sunday dinner. I drove back to Connecticut, my chest buzzing with an unfamiliar sense of intense pride. I had the officially signed corporate contract safely tucked in my leather bag. I was completely ready to slam it down on the dining table and loudly prove, once and for all, that I was not the pathetic family failure. I was a legitimate, self-made businessman. I walked through the heavy oak front door of my parents' house, and immediately, I knew something was deeply wrong. The entire house was elaborately decorated with expensive white lilies and silk ribbons. Aunt Beatrice, Uncle Henry, and my snobby cousins were all standing around holding drinks. Julian was standing dead center in the living room, wearing a tailored suit, holding a crystal glass of champagne, with Preston standing right next to him looking incredibly smug. "Arthur," my dad called out, not actually looking at my face but gesturing vaguely in my general direction. "Grab a drink from the kitchen. We are heavily celebrating today." I walked quickly into the kitchen. My mom was frantically arranging expensive catering platters of caviar and crab puffs. "Mom," I said, my voice actually shaking slightly with raw excitement, "I have huge news. I really need to tell you guys something. I just signed a massive contract for my software company. $300,000. I'm officially scaling the business." She did not even turn around to look at me. She just kept arranging the food. "That is nice, Arthur. Could you please just carry these crab puffs out to the guests? Julian just proposed to Preston this morning, and they are planning a massive spring wedding. We are currently discussing the country club venue budget and the guest list." I stood there, completely frozen, holding the heavy silver plate of appetizers. $300,000. My blood, my sweat, and my absolute tears, reduced instantly to, "That is nice. Carry the food for your brother." I numbly walked out to the living room. Julian was holding up his hand, loudly showing off a massive, custom-made platinum engagement ring. Preston was loudly bragging to my uncle about how he flew a private jeweler in from Antwerp just to design the specific cut. My father was heartily patting Preston on the back, warmly calling him son, and offering to pay for the open bar at the reception. I tried one more desperate time. I sat down at the dinner table. During a very rare, brief lull in the loud conversation, I cleared my throat loudly. "Dad, I actually wanted to share something important. My company, NovaSync, just secured our biggest corporate client to date. We are heavily projecting a massive revenue jump by the fourth quarter." My dad looked at me over his expensive reading glasses, thoroughly annoyed at the interruption. "NovaSync, right? The computer stuff. Make sure you are paying your self-employment taxes properly, Arthur. The IRS does not play around with freelancers and independent contractors." He immediately turned his head back to Preston. "So, Preston, tell me more about this exciting $2 million real estate venture you are looking to close on next month." I gripped my heavy silver fork until my knuckles turned completely white and my hand began to ache. I looked slowly around the large table. Aunt Beatrice was utterly fawning over Julian's ring. My mother was practically vibrating with intense joy as she discussed floral arrangements. Not a single person asked me what my company actually did. Not a single person asked how I managed to secure such a huge financial deal at 23. I was completely invisible. I quietly excused myself from the table. Nobody noticed me stand up. I walked slowly up the stairs to my old childhood bedroom, which had shockingly been converted into Julian's personal, high-end home gym. I sat heavily on a cold-weight bench in the absolute dark and pulled out my phone. I dialed Marcus's number. He answered on the second ring, hearing the heavy silence on my end. "Hey man, how is the big victory lap with the family going?" My throat felt incredibly tight, like I was swallowing glass. "They do not care, Marcus. They did not even listen to a single word I said." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. Marcus was a tough guy who had grown up bouncing around the brutal foster care system. He understood deep rejection better than anyone I knew. "Arthur," he said, his voice deadly serious and entirely devoid of pity, "stop trying to buy fresh bread at a hardware store. They are never, ever going to give you what you want. Stop telling them anything. Build the massive empire in total silence. Let the outrageous success make all the noise for you. That single, profound conversation rewired my brain permanently. I realized with absolute clarity that I was acting exactly like a starving, pathetic dog begging for tiny scraps under a wealthy king's table. I did not need their conditional approval. I did not need their fake applause. I was going to build something so massively undeniable, so incredibly powerful, that they would eventually choke on their own profound ignorance. I packed my bag, left no note, walked out the front door, and drove back to my small apartment in the middle of the dark night. I was completely done being the tragic victim of their narrative. I was stepping directly into the eye of the storm, and I was going to conquer it alone. The next 5 consecutive years were an absolute, blinding blur of relentless, obsessive, uncompromising work. I completely and utterly detached from my family's ongoing, exhausting drama. When they called me, which was incredibly rare and usually just to ask for a minor favor, I kept my answers incredibly brief and utterly devoid of emotion. Yes, I was completely fine. Yes, I was still working on computers. No, I absolutely could not make it to Julian's lavish engagement party. No, I could not make it to their ridiculously expensive destination wedding in Aspen because of a scheduling conflict. I was busy. And I was incredibly busy. NovaSync rapidly grew from a scrappy 2-man operation running out of a cheap apartment into a massive, highly respected corporate headquarters located right in the bustling heart of downtown Boston. By the time I turned 25 years old, we had 47 full-time, highly paid employees, and we were pulling in over $7 million in annual recurring revenue. By the time I was 26, aggressive venture capital firms were practically kicking my heavy glass office doors down, begging to invest. I lived a truly bizarre, highly calculated double life. On paper and in the tech industry, I was a wealthy, highly sought-after multimillionaire CEO. In reality, I intentionally lived in a very modest, severely minimalist apartment, wore plain black t-shirts every single day, and purposely drove a 5-year-old, totally unremarkable Honda Civic. I did not want the flashy lifestyle. I wanted absolute, unbreakable financial security. The massive acquisition offers started rolling in incredibly heavily when I turned 28. A massive, globally recognized Silicon Valley tech conglomerate offered me exactly $120 million in a total buyout. My board of directors practically begged me on their hands and knees to take the life-changing deal. But the corporate terms were absolute garbage. They explicitly wanted to completely dismantle NovaSync, fire my entire core engineering team, and just cannibalize my clean code to patch up their own incredibly outdated, buggy systems. I confidently walked into the main boardroom, looked the arrogant conglomerate executives dead in the eye, and firmly told them to get out of my building. I was absolutely not selling my entire life's work to a corporate chop shop. Then, everything changed when I met Victoria. Victoria was the highly respected, fiercely intelligent CEO of Innovix Technologies, a massive global firm. She was incredibly sharp, utterly ruthless in business, and entirely self-made from the ground up. We met for a private business lunch at an ultra-high-end, incredibly exclusive steakhouse in downtown Boston. She did not treat me like some lucky kid who stumbled into money. She treated me like a brilliant peer and a formidable equal. "I absolutely do not want to gut your company, Arthur," Victoria said firmly, gracefully cutting into her expensive dry-aged steak. "I want to strap a massive corporate rocket to it. You stay on permanently as the CEO. You keep your entire loyal team. We provide the massive global infrastructure, the legal teams, and the bottomless capital to forcefully push NovaSync into the highly lucrative European and Asian tech markets. You maintain total creative control. We just make you significantly bigger." The intense legal negotiations took 3 grueling, exhausting months. I had the absolute best, most expensive corporate lawyers in the entire city fighting aggressively for every single minor clause and addendum. I brilliantly secured massive, multi-million-dollar retention bonuses for Marcus and the rest of my original loyal staff. When the final, massive stack of contracts was confidently pushed across the heavy mahogany table, the final number printed boldly at the bottom was truly staggering. $310 million. After paying all the heavy corporate taxes, the massive legal fees, and successfully cashing out my early investors, my personal undeniable take-home amount was exactly $160 million. I signed the final, life-altering paperwork with a heavy, solid gold pen. My hand did not shake even a fraction of a millimeter. I felt an overwhelming, deep sense of absolute peace. I had completely won the game they told me I couldn't even play. I strategically kept exactly $25 million entirely liquid, sitting comfortably in high-yield corporate checking and savings accounts for immediate access. I let my brilliant team of financial advisors aggressively diversify the rest into secure bonds, stocks, and international assets. I finally, after years of grinding, allowed myself to actually enjoy the fruits of my intense labor. I purchased a stunning, sprawling $4 million waterfront mansion in a quiet, incredibly exclusive neighborhood. I paid straight, undeniable cash. No mortgage, no banks, no debt whatsoever. And, because a small, deeply buried part of me really wanted a flashy trophy, I confidently walked into a high-end dealership and bought a brand-new, heavily customized red Ferrari. But I absolutely did not post a single solitary picture on any social media platform. I did not call my parents to brag. I continued to drive the old Honda Civic whenever I had to run basic errands or go to the grocery store, keeping the roaring Ferrari securely locked away in my climate-controlled, multi-car garage. Thanksgiving was fast approaching. It had been years since I had sat at their incredibly toxic dining table. I had wisely spent the last 2 years working very closely with a highly respected, incredibly expensive therapist named Dr. Eris. I had spent countless, painful hours slowly unpacking the severe, deeply damaging emotional neglect I had suffered in that cold house. "Why do you suddenly want to go back there, Arthur?" Dr. Eris asked me calmly during our intense session in early November, adjusting his glasses. "You literally have everything a man could want. You have massive wealth, industry respect, and a fiercely loyal team. What are you desperately looking for in that specific dining room?" I looked quietly out the large window of his high-rise office, watching the city traffic below. "I really want to know if they still hold any psychological power over me," I admitted truthfully. "I want to look them dead in the eye and see if I still feel like that pathetic, ignored 9-year-old boy watching a shiny Porsche roll up the driveway. If I still care about their validation, I know I have a lot more mental work to do. If I don't, then I am finally truly free." Dr. Eris nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the test. "Just remember, Arthur, you absolutely do not owe them a grand performance or an explanation. Your immense worth is already completely solidified." I called my mother later that evening to officially RSVP for the dinner. She sounded completely shocked to hear my voice, then immediately shifted right back into her usual, condescending tone. "Oh, Arthur. Good. Julian and Preston will definitely be here. It will be a very full, busy house. Try to actually dress nicely this year, please. We have important guests coming." I hung up the phone without arguing, walked calmly into my massive home office, and deliberately picked up the thick, heavy leather-bound folder containing the final Innovix corporate acquisition documents and my latest bank statements. I placed it gently and securely into the inside pocket of my custom-tailored suit jacket. I genuinely did not know if I was actually going to use it, but I deeply wanted the weapon fully loaded and ready. I drove back to Connecticut that Thursday in the old Honda Civic. The sky was a heavy gray, and the air was freezing cold. I pulled slowly into the massive, familiar driveway, parking my cheap car directly behind Julian's brand-new, ridiculously expensive Range Rover and Preston's leased BMW. I took a deep, steadying breath, grabbed my jacket, and walked confidently up to the grand front door. I was walking straight into the eye of the storm, but this time, I was the one entirely controlling the weather. I stepped out of my 5-year-old Honda Civic and felt the biting chill of the Connecticut November air hit my face. The sheer visual contrast in the massive, sweeping driveway was almost comical. My faded gray sedan was parked directly behind Julian's pristine, aggressively waxed Range Rover and Preston's ridiculously expensive leased BMW. To any outside observer, my car looked like it belonged to the hired catering staff. To me, it was the perfect, unassuming armor. I grabbed my overnight bag, feeling the reassuring weight of the leather folder tucked safely inside my tailored suit jacket, and walked up the wide brick steps to the grand front entrance. Before I even had the chance to press the brass doorbell, the heavy oak door swung wide open. My Aunt Beatrice stood there, holding a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, her face already flushed with early evening alcohol. She looked me up and down, her heavily mascaraed eyes instantly zeroing in on my lack of a designer watch or flashy accessories. "Arthur," she announced loudly, her voice dripping with that signature, suffocating blend of fake warmth and genuine condescension. "You actually made the drive. We were all taking bets on whether your little jalopy would break down on the interstate. Come in, come in. Wipe your shoes thoroughly on the mat. Your mother just had the marble foyer professionally polished." I stepped inside the massive house. It smelled exactly the same as it had during my miserable childhood. It was a suffocating mix of expensive floor wax, heavy cinnamon candles, and the overwhelming scent of roasted meat emanating from the designer kitchen. Nothing had changed. The grand, sweeping staircase still looked like a movie set, and the walls were still lined with framed, professional photographs of Julian. Julian playing lacrosse. Julian graduating from his elite private school. Julian receiving his incredibly expensive college fund from my beaming parents. There was not a single solitary picture of me anywhere in sight. I was a ghost returning to a house that had never acknowledged my life. I walked slowly into the expansive living room. The large stone fireplace was roaring, casting a warm, flickering orange light over the wildly expensive leather furniture. Julian and Preston were standing dead center, completely holding court, surrounded by my parents, Uncle Henry, and two of my older cousins. They were all laughing loudly at something Preston had just said. My father, Richard, looked up and finally noticed me standing awkwardly on the edge of the expensive Persian rug. "Arthur, you made it?" he said, his tone incredibly flat, completely devoid of any paternal warmth or genuine excitement. "Go grab a drink from the bar cart. Just do not touch the vintage scotch." Preston brought that over specifically to celebrate his recent promotion at the firm. "Congratulations on the promotion, Preston," I said calmly, walking over to pour myself a simple glass of sparkling water. Preston smirked, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. "Thanks, Arthur. It is a massive step up. The firm is absolutely crushing the market this quarter. Managing director level comes with a lot of heavy responsibilities. But the compensation package is undeniable. We are heavily leveraging the new income to expand our real estate portfolio. You really have to diversify if you want to build generational wealth." Julian leaned into Preston, resting his hand proudly on Preston's shoulder. Preston is being incredibly modest. He is practically running the entire Northeast Division now. We are currently closing on a stunning $2 million property in Westchester. It has a massive wine cellar, a private tennis court, and it is in the absolute best school district for when we eventually decide to start a family. My mother, Eleanor, walked into the room carrying a silver tray of complicated appetizers. She practically beamed with radiant, unfiltered joy as she looked at Julian. "Oh, Julian, it is just so incredibly wonderful. You two are building such a perfect, beautiful life together. It is everything a mother could ever possibly want for her son." I stood silently by the bar cart, taking a slow sip of my water. I watched the entire interaction with a cold, almost anthropological fascination. I did not feel the familiar, crushing sting of jealousy that used to paralyze my chest when I was younger. I did not feel the desperate, burning urge to shout about my own achievements just to get their attention. I just watched them carefully, analyzing their body language and their loud, boastful words. I knew something that they absolutely did not know. I had spent years in the tech industry, and my financial advisors moved in the exact same elite circles as Preston's flashy hedge fund. I knew for a definitive fact that the commercial real estate market they were heavily leveraging was currently standing on the edge of a massive cliff. I knew that people who bragged loudly about their wealth at family dinners were usually the ones drowning under a mountain of hidden debt and aggressive credit lines. They were playing a highly dangerous game of appearances, completely funded by borrowed money and fragile corporate titles. "So, Arthur?" Uncle Henry suddenly said, loudly breaking my train of thought. He always tried to make small talk, but it always ended up sounding like an interrogation at a parole hearing. "How are things up in Boston? Are you still doing the computer repair stuff? Or did you finally find a stable position at a real company?" The entire room went completely silent. Every single pair of eyes shifted directly to me. It was the exact dynamic they loved the most. They loved to establish their towering superiority by highlighting my supposed pathetic mediocrity. "I am still working in the software industry, Uncle Henry," I replied evenly, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of defensive anger. "Things are going very well. We have had a very busy year." Julian let out a short, incredibly patronizing laugh. "Software industry, right? Arthur, you really need to be careful with the whole freelance gig economy thing. It is totally fine for your early 20s when you are just figuring things out, but you are creeping up on 30 now. You need real health insurance. You need a solid 401k match. If you want, I can talk to some of the entry-level HR recruiters at my marketing firm. They always need low-level IT guys to fix the jammed printers and reset passwords. The salary is not great, but it is steady." My mother nodded in aggressive agreement, her expensive earrings catching the firelight. "You really should listen to your brother, Arthur. He knows exactly how the corporate world works. You cannot just live in a tiny apartment forever, playing on your computer. You have to start thinking about your long-term future before it is completely too late." I looked directly at Julian. I looked at the smug, intensely satisfied smile plastered across his face. I felt the heavy leather folder pressing warmly against my ribs. I had $160 million sitting securely in my personal accounts. I owned a $4 million mansion fully outright. I had literally changed the entire landscape of global logistics software. And this deeply arrogant man, who was drowning in high-interest mortgages and leasing his luxury cars, was publicly offering me a job fixing jammed office printers. "I appreciate the offer, Julian," I said, offering him a perfectly blank, unreadable smile. "But I think my career is on a pretty solid trajectory right now. I do not think I will be needing your HR contacts anytime soon." Aunt Beatrice aggressively rolled her eyes, taking another large gulp of her drink. "Well, do not say your family never tried to help you when you end up struggling to pay your heating bill this winter. Some people are just incredibly stubborn." My father loudly clapped his hands together, instantly terminating the conversation before I could respond. "All right, enough business talk. Eleanor, is the dinner ready?" Preston brought a spectacular vintage wine that needs to be poured, and I am absolutely starving. We all moved slowly into the grand dining room. I took my usual, designated seat at the far end of the massive table, as far away from the center of attention as physically possible. The table was meticulously set with the fine china, the heavy crystal goblets, and the expensive silver cutlery. As I sat down, I quietly unbuttoned my suit jacket. I reached inside, pulled out the thick leather folder, and placed it gently on the table, resting it right next to my water glass. Nobody noticed the folder yet. They were too busy loudly arguing over who got the best cuts of the roasted turkey and aggressively complimenting my mother on her dry, flavorless stuffing. The trap was completely, perfectly set. The suffocating arrogance in the room was so incredibly thick you could cut it with a knife. They had spent the last 2 hours meticulously building their grand pedestals, thoroughly enjoying the view from the top while looking down on me. They had absolutely no idea that I was about to detonate a financial nuclear bomb right in the middle of their perfect manufactured reality. I took a slow, deep breath, picked up my fork, and waited patiently for the absolute perfect moment to strike. The dinner progressed exactly as it had for the last 2 decades. It was a relentless, exhausting parade of self-congratulatory boasting. My father loudly recounted a minor golf tournament he had recently won at the country club, demanding absolute silence while he explained his swing technique. Julian and Preston tag-teamed a long, boring story about a high society charity gala they had attended, specifically name-dropping wealthy politicians and minor celebrities to ensure everyone at the table understood their immense social value. I ate my food in total, calculated silence. I watched the wine bottles slowly empty and the volume of the room steadily increase. I was waiting. I was a sniper carefully controlling my breathing, waiting for the target to walk directly into the crosshairs. The moment finally arrived right as my mother was directing the catering staff to clear the dinner plates and bring out the expensive dessert spread. The conversation had temporarily lulled, and the room was relatively quiet. My mother looked down the long expanse of the mahogany table directly at me. She tilted her head, adopting that incredibly fake, deeply concerned expression she always used right before delivering a crushing insult. "Are you still playing around with those little computer apps, Arthur?" she asked, her voice carrying loudly across the silent room. "You really need to find a job with a real salary so you do not end up homeless or constantly begging us for your future inheritance. Your father and I work incredibly hard to maintain our lifestyle, and we cannot support a grown man who refuses to join the real world." The entire table went dead silent. Aunt Beatrice let out a sharp, condescending chuckle. Julian smirked, leaning back in his expensive chair and crossing his arms over his chest. My father just stared at me, slowly shaking his head in profound, theatrical disappointment. It was the ultimate public humiliation. It was the exact moment they had been building toward all evening. I did not flinch. I did not look down at my plate in shame. I slowly placed my heavy silver fork down on the pristine linen tablecloth. I looked my mother directly in the eyes, holding her gaze until she actually shifted slightly in her chair, suddenly uncomfortable with my absolute lack of reaction. I reached out and placed my hand firmly on top of the thick leather folder resting next to my water glass. "Actually, Mom," I said, my voice incredibly calm, clear, and projecting perfectly down the length of the table. "I am not playing around with computer apps anymore. I recently had a very significant change in my employment status. I do not have a salary anymore." Julian let out a loud, highly exaggerated sigh of utter disbelief. "Oh, wonderful. Did you finally quit the freelance nonsense? Are you officially unemployed now?" "Because I meant what I said earlier, Arthur. I am not loaning you a single dime for your rent. You need to learn some personal responsibility." I ignored Julian completely. I opened the heavy leather folder and pulled out the crisp, legally binding summary sheet of the acquisition. I slid it smoothly down the polished mahogany table. It stopped right in front of my father's plate. "I am not unemployed, Julian," I stated, the temperature in my voice dropping to absolute zero. "I sold my company." My father looked down at the document. He picked up his reading glasses from the table, slid them onto his nose, and looked at the paper. "Sold your company? What company, Arthur? You do not own a company. You fix computers." "For the last 7 years, I explained slowly, articulating every single syllable so there could be no misunderstanding. "I have been the sole founder and chief executive officer of NovaSync. It is a highly specialized, globally recognized supply chain management software platform. We currently manage daily logistics operations across 8 different countries." Julian scoffed loudly, waving his hand in the air as if trying to swat away a fly. "Wait, what are you talking about? A global platform? You run it out of your tiny little apartment? That is mathematically impossible." "I did not run it out of my apartment, Julian. I ran it out of a massive corporate headquarters in downtown Boston with 47 full-time employees." I kept my eyes locked entirely on my father, watching his face closely. "Dad, read the highlighted number at the bottom of the first page. Please, read it out loud for the rest of the table." My father's face was suddenly draining of all color. He looked like a man who had just been violently struck by lightning. His hands, usually so steady and commanding, actually began to tremble slightly as he held the crisp document. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "Read it, Richard," Aunt Beatrice demanded, leaning over trying to see the paper. "What does it say? How much did he sell his little project for?" My father swallowed hard, his voice barely a hoarse, ragged whisper. $310 million. The silence that instantly slammed into the dining room was absolute, total, and completely deafening. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a massive vacuum pulling all the oxygen out of the space. Preston dropped his wine glass. It shattered against his crystal water goblet, but nobody even moved to clean it up. "That is a fake document," Julian suddenly shouted, his voice cracking wildly, pointing an aggressive finger at me from across the table. "This is a sick, twisted joke. You printed this out to ruin my evening. You are a low-level coder. You drive a beat-up Honda Civic, Arthur. You are completely broke." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and quickly unlocked it. I opened my primary corporate banking application, navigated to my main liquid checking account, and slid the glowing phone directly across the table toward Julian. "Look at the screen, Julian," I commanded softly. Julian leaned forward, his perfectly groomed face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He stared blindly at the glowing digital numbers. The $310 million was the total corporate acquisition price. I explained to the frozen room, my tone entirely conversational, as if I were discussing the weather. After massive corporate taxes, paying out my dedicated employees, and covering the high-end legal fees, my personal, totally undisputed take-home amount was exactly $160 million. What you are looking at right there on that screen, Julian, is the $25.5 million I currently keep entirely liquid in cash for my daily expenses. The rest is heavily invested in a highly diversified portfolio managed by people who are significantly smarter than Preston. My mother grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles turning bone white. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. "Arthur, I don't understand. When did this happen? Why didn't you ever tell us? We are your family." "You never asked, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through her fake shock like a surgeon's scalpel. "For 20 years, you never once asked about my life. Every single time I tried to tell you about a massive contract or a major business victory, you immediately changed the subject to Julian's mediocre fraternity drama, or Julian's engagement, or Julian's college fund. I was completely invisible in this house. So, I stopped trying to make you see me. I built a massive empire entirely in the dark, without your approval, without your money, and absolutely without your support." Julian slammed his hand violently against the table, making the silverware aggressively rattle. "You are a liar. You are intensely jealous of me. You always have been. You intentionally waited until tonight, when everyone was celebrating my success and Preston's promotion, just to steal the spotlight. You are pathetic." I looked at Julian, genuinely feeling a deep, profound wave of pity for the absolute shell of a man sitting across from me. "I am not jealous of you, Julian. I actually feel incredibly sorry for you." That single statement knocked him completely off balance. He froze, his face red with rage. "What did you just say?" "I said I feel sorry for you," I repeated, standing up slowly from my chair and buttoning my suit jacket. "Everything you currently have in your life was handed directly to you on a silver platter. Your expensive education, your fancy car, your elite network. Dad literally called in major corporate favors to get you that job you brag about. You have never actually had to fight for a single thing in your entire life. You have never had to prove your actual worth to a room full of people who wanted you to fail. And now, you are loudly bragging about leveraging yourself into massive debt just to buy a piece of real estate you cannot actually afford, just to impress people who do not actually care about you." Preston stood up abruptly, his face flushed with extreme anger. "You watch your mouth, Arthur. You have absolutely no idea how high-level finance works." "I know exactly how it works, Preston," I countered, staring him down until he physically stepped back. "I know that your specific hedge fund is currently bleeding capital, and I know that buying a $2 million house on leveraged credit in a fluctuating market is financial suicide. But you go ahead and enjoy your HOA meetings." My father finally found his voice. He stood up, trying to project his usual towering patriarchal authority, but his shoulders were slumped, and he looked incredibly old. "Arthur, I think it is best if you leave my house immediately. You have deeply disrespected this family." I picked up my phone and my leather folder. I looked at the stunned, completely silent faces of my extended family. "I am already leaving, Dad. I didn't come here to ruin your dinner or demand your respect. I came here to prove to myself that I absolutely do not need it anymore. Enjoy the turkey." I turned my back on them and walked slowly and deliberately out of the grand dining room, leaving my entirely shattered, completely humiliated family sitting in the deafening ruins of their own shattered arrogance. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The moment I closed the heavy front door behind me, the cold night air felt incredibly refreshing. I walked briskly down the long, sweeping driveway, got into my quiet Honda Civic, and started the engine. Before I had even reached the main highway, my phone started aggressively vibrating in the cup holder. It was an absolute avalanche of frantic communication. Julian was calling repeatedly, leaving completely unhinged, screaming voicemails calling me every single name in the book. My mother sent a massive wall of text messages, rapidly oscillating between angry accusations of deception and desperate, crying pleas for me to turn the car around so we could talk as a loving family. My father sent one single, severely stern message demanding family loyalty and an immediate apology for my outrageous behavior. Even Aunt Beatrice tried to call, no doubt calculating exactly how she could manipulate my newfound wealth to fund her own ridiculous lifestyle. I didn't answer a single call. I didn't read past the first line of any text. I activated the block feature on my phone for every single one of their numbers, effectively severing the toxic anchor that had dragged me down for my entire life. I drove back to my $4 million waterfront home, poured myself a glass of incredibly expensive bourbon, and slept better than I had in 20 years. However, the utter chaos I had left behind in Connecticut was far from over. Exactly 1 week after that explosive Thanksgiving dinner, a thick, heavy envelope arrived at my house via certified corporate mail. The return address belonged to a highly aggressive, notoriously expensive family law attorney based out of Hartford. I opened the letter while sitting at my kitchen island. It was a formal, legally threatening demand letter. Aunt Beatrice, completely unable to stomach the idea that I had money she couldn't touch, had apparently convinced my easily manipulated parents to officially retain a lawyer. The letter aggressively demanded $5 million in immediate compensation. They were legally arguing that they were entitled to a massive return on the financial investment they had made in my basic upbringing, claiming my immense corporate success was a direct result of their parental guidance. It was the most pathetic, desperate legal maneuver I had ever seen. They were literally trying to send me a retroactive bill for my childhood. I didn't panic. I didn't scream. I smiled. I picked up my phone and called the managing partner of the massive corporate law firm that had successfully handled my $300 million acquisition. I explained the situation to him. He actually laughed out loud over the phone. I didn't just tell them no. I utterly crushed them. I had my high-powered legal team draft a devastating response. We included a meticulously detailed, certified financial breakdown proving exactly how much money they had lavishly spent on Julian's private schools, cars, and college fund, contrasted sharply with the absolute bare minimum they had legally spent on my public education. We firmly informed their aggressive lawyer that if they ever attempted to contact me again, or pursue this ridiculous extortion attempt, I would immediately file a massive counter-lawsuit for severe emotional distress, financial negligence, and attempted corporate extortion. Furthermore, I legally threatened to release all of the humiliating documentation to their exclusive country club and the local Connecticut press, permanently destroying their precious social reputation. I never heard a single word from their expensive lawyer ever again. The threat of a highly public, entirely humiliating lawsuit instantly shattered their fragile bravery. But the absolute final collapse of their manufactured reality happened 2 months later. The economic storm I had predicted completely decimated the commercial real estate market. The specific sector that Preston's firm was heavily leveraged in suffered a catastrophic, absolute crash. The news broke on the major financial networks. Preston's hedge fund went entirely bankrupt overnight because they had arrogantly leveraged their own personal assets to secure the loans for that $2 million Westchester property. The banks immediately moved to seize everything they owned. Julian, the golden child who had never faced a single real consequence, completely broke down. The immense financial pressure instantly fractured their relationship. Within 3 weeks of the bankruptcy filing, Julian and Preston were officially filing for a highly contested, incredibly messy divorce. They were fighting aggressively over the remaining scraps of their shattered life, arguing viciously over the custody of their leased luxury cars and their rapidly depleting bank accounts. I found all this out because Julian, in a state of absolute rock-bottom desperation, used a burner phone to bypass my block and left me a sobbing, pathetic voicemail. He begged me for a massive loan. He pleaded for me to save his house, to pay for his aggressive divorce lawyers, and to rescue him from total financial ruin. He claimed we were brothers and that blood was thicker than water. I listened to the entire voicemail while sitting on the expansive balcony of my fully paid-off mansion, watching the calm river flow by. I felt absolutely nothing. No joy, no sadness, no lingering anger. Just a profound, quiet emptiness regarding the man who had tormented me my entire life. I deleted the voicemail, blocked the burner number, and went back inside to work on my next massive project. I was not a bank, and I was absolutely not going to fund the rescue of a man who had proudly laughed at my supposed poverty. 6 months quickly passed since the explosive events of Thanksgiving. The heavy, toxic weight of my family had been entirely lifted from my shoulders, and the profound silence they left behind was the greatest luxury I had ever acquired. I spent the Christmas holidays in Aspen, Colorado, but I wasn't staying in a cramped, budget hotel. I rented a massive, sprawling luxury chalet. I didn't invite blood relatives. I invited my real family. Marcus, my brilliant lead developer, flew out with his new wife. We spent our days aggressively skiing down the pristine mountains and our evenings drinking incredibly rare, expensive wine by a massive stone fireplace. We celebrated our immense, collective success, completely free from the suffocating judgment of people who didn't understand our intense grind. I wasn't resting on my financial laurels either. Retirement at 28 sounded incredibly boring. Marcus and I had already firmly established a brand new, highly aggressive tech startup focused entirely on AI-driven logistics solutions. We were already pulling in massive corporate interest and setting up infrastructure. But this time, I wasn't building my massive empire in total, terrifying silence. I was actively stepping into the light. In late spring, I received a highly formal, incredibly prestigious invitation. The business school at Yale University, the exact same elite institution my father had effectively bought Julian's way into, officially invited me to be the keynote speaker for their annual tech entrepreneurship conference. I seriously considered declining the invitation. The very name of the university carried a heavy, lingering stench of my family's toxic favoritism. But then I realized the profound, poetic justice of the situation. Julian had walked those pristine halls as a mediocre student funded by Daddy's checkbook. I was going to walk onto their grandest stage as an entirely self-made, wildly successful industry titan. I accepted the invitation. The massive auditorium was completely packed with hundreds of eager, hungry students and highly respected professors. I didn't give a boring, generic speech about corporate synergy or basic market trends. I gave a raw, entirely unvarnished speech about the brutal reality of creating massive success from absolute nothing. I spoke openly about the distinct advantage of being completely underestimated and how to weaponize the painful feeling of being entirely invisible into an unstoppable, aggressive drive. The massive audience hung on every single word. When the speech concluded, the Q&A session lasted for over an hour. As the heavy crowd finally began to slowly disperse, a young man nervously approached the edge of the stage. He was clutching a battered notebook, and his clothes looked like they had been purchased at a discount thrift store. He reminded me so intensely of myself at that age it actually made my chest ache. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice shaking slightly with raw nerves. "My name is Thomas. I really wanted to thank you for your speech today." "Call me Arthur," I replied, stepping down from the stage to meet him at eye level. "What are you studying, Thomas?" "Computer engineering," he said, looking down at his worn-out shoes. "I am a first-generation college student. I am only here on a massive academic scholarship. My family back home, they have absolutely no idea what I am doing here. They think I am wasting my time. They think I should have stayed in our small town, gotten a basic factory job, and just lived a simple, quiet life. Every time I call home, they make me feel like I am making a huge mistake." He looked up, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your story today, it made me feel significantly less alone in this." I looked at this young, brilliant kid who was currently fighting the exact same brutal, emotional war I had fought for 20 years. I didn't offer him a fake, corporate platitude. I reached out and grabbed him firmly by the shoulder. "You are absolutely not alone, Thomas," I said, my voice thick with genuine emotion. "And you are going to accomplish incredibly fantastic, massive things in this industry. Do not ever let anyone, especially the people who share your DNA, make you feel invisible or small. You use that pain. You build your massive empire in the dark, and you let the blinding success speak for you." He nodded, wiping a stray tear from his face, a massive, genuine smile breaking across his features. As he walked away into the crowd, a profound realization hit me with the force of a freight train. This specific moment right here, helping someone else survive the psychological trenches, was infinitely better than any temporary revenge. This was my actual purpose. My biological family still attempts to pathetically reach out on rare occasions. My mother sends generic, store-bought cards on my birthday, which is incredibly strange considering she forgot the date for 5 consecutive years. My father forwards me random, outdated tech articles to my corporate email, desperately trying to pretend he has always been deeply invested in my career. I heard through the grapevine that Julian is living in a tiny apartment, trying to secure custody of his dog in the bitter divorce settlement, while working a miserable entry-level sales job. I don't respond to any of their desperate attempts at connection, not out of lingering cruelty, but simply because I have successfully built a massive, beautiful life that absolutely does not require their presence. I don't care about their inevitable funeral arrangements, their messy divorces, or their shattered legacies. I earned my painful invisibility, and then I aggressively forged my own blinding visibility. The massive wealth is incredibly nice, and the global industry success is deeply gratifying. But the absolute best part of this entire grueling journey is that I can finally look in the mirror and see myself clearly. And that quiet, unbreakable peace is worth infinitely more than $160 million. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to cut toxic people out of your life to finally achieve your own success? Share your raw story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.